At 7:47 on a Monday morning, Scarlet walked through the school gates the same way she always did, backpack over one shoulder, grade point average of 4.0, and 3 weeks of work tucked under her arm in a manila folder held together with a rubber band. She had spent those 3 weeks in library carols and at the kitchen table, pulling public records, cross-referencing budget reports, running numbers she wasn't supposed to know how to run. The folder was neat, the work was careful, and not a single figure in it was wrong. At 8:15, the principal called her out of class. At 8:31, she was suspended, no written reason, no formal notice, and no chance to call her father. They thought they were silencing a 16-year-old girl. What they did not know, what none of them had bothered to find out, was that the man who drove the old sedan every morning and stood at the drop-off curb waving goodbye was already picking up his phone. And he knew things. He knew far too many things. Don't look away from this one. The ending will surprise you. The morning had begun the way all of their mornings began. Theodore Morrison was up before the sun, wearing the same faded flannel shirt he wore on every day that didn't require a suit, standing at the kitchen counter with a mug of coffee going cold beside him. He was not a man who wasted motion. He read, he thought. And he moved through the house quietly, in the unhurried way of someone who had learned long ago that urgency and noise were not the same thing. Scarlet came downstairs at 6:50, already dressed, already alert. She was 16 years old and built of the same interior stillness her father carried, though in her, it expressed itself differently, as confidence instead of reserve, as directness instead of patience. She had her mother's eyes and her father's mind, and she had spent the last 3 weeks using both. She set the folder on the breakfast table while she poured orange juice. Theodore glanced at it. "You sure you want to turn that in today?" he asked. She looked at him over the rim of her glass. "Every number checks out." He nodded slowly. "I know it does." That was all he said. Scarlet noticed the slight pause before the nod, the way his jaw settled after he spoke. She interpreted it as fatherly caution, the ordinary worry of a parent who loved her. She was not wrong about the love. She was wrong about the caution. On the desk in the small back room he used as a study, a brown accordion folder sat closed, its label turned face down. It had been there for weeks. Scarlet had never asked about it. Theodore had never mentioned it. Some things in their house were simply present, the way furniture was present, part of the background, unexamined. He drove her to school in the old sedan. They talked about her friend Grace, who was nervous about an oral presentation that afternoon. They talked about whether the gas station on the corner had raised its prices again. The drive was 12 minutes and felt like every other 12-minute drive they had made together since she started at Hargrove High. When she stepped out at the curb, she waved without turning around. The manila folder pressed against her ribs. Theodore watched her walk through the gates. He did not pull away immediately. He sat with the engine idling, eyes on the entrance, one hand resting on the steering wheel. A beat passed, then another, then he shifted into drive and left. Anyone watching from the sidewalk would have seen nothing unusual. They would have seen a father who was slow to leave because fathers sometimes were. What they would not have seen was the arithmetic happening behind his eyes. First period had barely begun when the classroom door opened and the office aide appeared. She whispered to the teacher, and the teacher turned to look at Scarlet with an expression that carried something careful in it, something managed. Scarlet picked up her bag. She did not yet feel afraid. She thought, perhaps, that she was being called in to discuss the project. She thought it would be a conversation. She had stopped by the journalism room before class and handed the folder to Mrs. Evelyn Marsh, the faculty advisor for the student paper. Evelyn had taken it, flipped to the second page, and gone very still. She looked up at Scarlet with an expression the girl could not fully read. "Scarlet," she said, in the tone adults used when they meant something they weren't saying, "before this goes any further, you should think very carefully about whether you want your name on this." Scarlet had looked at her steadily. "Is anything in it inaccurate?" Evelyn did not answer that. She said Scarlet should wait. Now Scarlet sat across from Principal Richard Holt in his office. He was the kind of man who used stillness as a management technique, who stood rather than sat during difficult conversations so that he held the height advantage, who let silences sit between sentences until the other person felt compelled to fill them. He was practiced at this. He had done it with parents, with teachers, with school board members. He had never once done it with a student who looked back at him the way Scarlet was looking at him now. "You're being suspended," he said. "Effective immediately." 3 school days. She asked the obvious question. He gave her the obvious non-answer. Something about conduct. Something about the disruption of the learning environment. The language was technically complete and substantively empty, and they both knew it. When she asked to call her father, he told her that the school would contact her parent through the proper notification procedure. The proper notification procedure. She was 16 and she had spent 3 weeks documenting the misuse of $340,000 in public education funds, and the man in front of her was explaining the proper notification procedure. An office administrator appeared beside her chair with the manila folder in her hands. She set it on the principal's desk without making eye contact. Holt placed one palm flat on top of it. "We'll hold on to this," he said, as though he were doing her a favor. Scarlet stood. She picked up her backpack. She walked out of the office and through the front doors, and stood on the concrete apron outside the school entrance in the pale October light. She did not cry. She looked at the building for a long moment at the brick, and the institutional windows, and the flag at the top of its pole, and then she looked down at her empty hands. Behind her, a side door pushed open. Grace came through it at a near run, breathless. Her own backpack still on. She had heard everything through the thin wall between her classroom and the office corridor. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket and pressed it into Scarlet's hand. "I'm going to call your dad," she said. "I know his number. You gave it to me last year, remember?" Scarlet looked at the paper. It was blank. Grace had grabbed whatever was nearest. She folded it again and put it in her pocket, because sometimes what mattered was not the paper but the hand that gave it. "Thank you," she said quietly. Grace was already reaching for her own phone. Theodore was at his desk in the back room when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, the area code was local, the rest he didn't recognize. He answered on the second ring. The voice was young and slightly unsteady, and it belonged to a girl named Grace, who spoke in quick, clipped sentences, like someone who was afraid of losing her nerve before she finished. She told him what had happened. She told him Scarlet was standing outside. She told him they had taken the folder. Theodore asked 3 questions. What time had it occurred? Who had issued the suspension? And then, in a tone so measured it gave Grace pause. "Where is the folder now?" Grace said she thought it was in the principal's office. She wasn't sure. He thanked her, told her she had done the right thing, and ended the call. He sat for 2 seconds with the phone in his hand. Then he stood, opened the accordion folder on his desk, the one with the label turned face down, and removed a sheaf of documents from the middle section. He looked at them briefly. He already knew what they said. He had read them several times. He put them back, tucked the folder under his arm, and went to get his keys. He found Scarlet sitting on the low concrete wall at the edge of the school's front drive. She stood when she saw the sedan. She was holding herself in the same still, collected way she always did, but he had known her since the moment she existed, and he could see what it was costing her. He got out of the car. He hugged her first. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there with his hand on the back of her head. Then he said, "Tell me everything. In order." She did. He listened without interrupting. When she got to the part about the folder being taken, he nodded once. The same slow nod as that morning. And this time she noticed what was underneath it. "Dad," she said, "you already knew something was wrong with this school." He looked at her. "Let me go inside and speak with the principal." He was polite at the front desk. He filled out the visitor form. He sat in the waiting area and read nothing from his phone while he waited, which was not because he had nothing to read, but because he was listening to the way the staff spoke to each other, to the particular quality of the silence in the main office, to what was present and what was conspicuously absent. When they called him in, he shook Richard Holt's hand. He listened to the same non-explanation Scarlet had received, delivered this time with additional bureaucratic scaffolding. He did not interrupt. He did not raise his voice. At the end of it, he said, "Thank you for explaining. I'll look into this carefully." Holt relaxed slightly. He thought it was finished. On his way out, Theodore stopped in the hallway near the trophy cases. A laminated sheet was tacked to the corkboard between 2 sets of lockers, the current members of the Hargrove District Board of Education, listed by name and title. He read each one. He took out his phone and photographed the list. Then he walked to his car, where Scarlet was waiting, and he drove home. Scarlet went to bed at 9:30. She did not know that by then her father had been sitting at his desk for more than an hour, and that the back room, which was usually a quiet and unremarkable space, had been transformed into something else entirely. The accordion folder was open. A second folder, this one retrieved from a locked drawer, was open beside it. On the screen of his laptop, Theodore had pulled up 3 separate databases: the Public Financial Disclosure Portal for the school district, the State-Level Business Registration Archive, and an internal records system that was not accessible to the general public. The login for the third one had been provided to him 6 years ago, when he took the position of State Education Oversight Commissioner. He had never used it for personal purposes. He opened it now without ceremony, because what had happened to his daughter was not, in his estimation, a personal matter. It had become an institutional one, the moment a public school used public authority to suppress a student's factual findings about public funds. He began with the budgetary reports. The school's published expenditure records showed a line item that appeared in 3 consecutive annual filings, labeled under the heading of Program Development. The total across those 3 years was $340,000. There were no itemized receipts attached to any of the filings. There was no external audit trail. There was, in the language of financial documentation, simply a number and a category, sitting there like a door with no handle. He traced the number to a vendor. The vendor was registered as Meridian EdTech Solutions, incorporated approximately 4 months before the first contract was signed. The listed business address was a residential unit in a condominium complex on the east side of town. He looked up the ownership record for the unit. It belonged to a man named Edward Callum. Edward Callum was the chairman of the Hargrove District Board of Education. Theodore wrote the name on a yellow legal pad. He drew a single horizontal line beneath it and moved on. The registered directors of Meridian EdTech Solutions were listed in the State Archive. There were 3 of them. Edward Callum, a woman named Margaret Alcott, who held the title of vice chair on the school board, and a man named Charles Brennan, who served as the board member responsible for the Finance and Budgetary Oversight Committee. The same 3 people who controlled the money had built the company that received the money. They had then voted, collectively, to approve the contracts that sent the money there. In none of the filings, in none of the board meeting minutes, in none of the publicly available records, had any of them ever disclosed a conflict of interest. Theodore looked at Scarlet's original research, a copy of which he had quietly made 3 days earlier when he found her working on it at the kitchen table. Her approach had been methodical, and her conclusions were correct. She had found the same thread he had been looking for. She had simply gotten there with library access and determination. While his team had been working through the slower machinery of formal procedure, he looked through the open doorway at the hallway that led to her room. The light under her door was off. He turned back to the screen and began drafting a message. He addressed it to Benjamin Walsh, the legal counsel for the State Department of Education, and to 2 senior members of the fiscal review team. The subject line read, "Request for Emergency Consultation Institutional Integrity, Hargrove District." He did not tell them who he was in relation to the student involved. He would tell them in person. By 8 o'clock the next morning, Edward Callum had already received 2 messages from Richard Holt. The first had come the previous afternoon. The father had visited, seemed calmer than expected, appeared to accept the explanation. Probably nothing to worry about. The second arrived overnight. On reflection, Holt wanted to flag that the father had asked specifically about the folder. He had used the word specifically. That was what Holt remembered. He had seemed very calm, very specific. Edward read both messages at his desk in the board's administrative office, which occupied a suite on the 2nd floor of the district services building. He was a careful man who had made the kind of mistakes that careful men make when they have gone too long without facing real consequences. He forwarded both messages to Margaret and Charles and called an informal video meeting for 9 that morning. The 4 of them, Edward, Margaret, Charles, and Holt, spent 40 minutes deciding that the situation was manageable. Margaret pointed out that they had handled difficult parents before. Holt reminded them that he had documented everything correctly. Charles noted that no one outside the room had access to the relevant records. Edward agreed with all 3 assessments. "The man drives an old Chevrolet and works somewhere in county government," Margaret said. "Whatever he thinks he found, he doesn't have the reach to do anything with it." What none of them did, in those 40 minutes, was search Theodore Morrison's name in the state government directory. It was the one obvious step. None of them took it. They concluded the meeting with a plan. Holt would prepare a formal documentation package establishing the grounds for Scarlet's suspension, retroactive paperwork, carefully worded. Margaret would draft a communication to the full parent body, referencing an unnamed student who had circulated misleading information about school finances. Edward would contact the district's legal counsel to obtain a letter confirming that the suspension was procedurally sound. Charles said nothing for the last 10 minutes of the meeting, which no one mentioned. The parent notification went out that afternoon through the school's messaging system. It did not name Scarlet, but it did not need to. Grace forwarded the screenshot to Scarlet within minutes of it arriving. Scarlet read it once, put her phone down, and picked it up again. Her hands were steady, but there was a tightness in her throat that she didn't try to suppress, because suppressing it would have taken energy she didn't want to spend on them. She called her father. He was already in his car. He told her not to read any more of the message thread. He told her he would be home before dinner. His voice was the same as it always was. "Dad," she said. "Where are you going?" A brief pause. "I have a meeting." She waited. He said nothing more. She said, "Okay." The State Department of Education occupied a 6-story building downtown, gray stone and long windows, with the state seal mounted above the main entrance. Theodore pulled into the parking structure at 10:40 and rode the elevator to the 3rd floor. The receptionist at the department's administrative wing looked up when the elevator opened, recognized him immediately, and stood. "Commissioner Morrison," she said. "Mr. Walsh and the review team are set up in conference room B." Theodore nodded and walked down the corridor. He had held the position of State Education Oversight Commissioner for 6 years. He had been appointed in his mid-40s, after 2 decades of work in public finance and institutional accountability work, that had taken him from municipal auditing to federal oversight consulting before landing him in the role he now occupied. His office had investigative authority over every public school district in the state. He had the power to compel the production of financial records, to suspend board members pending review, and to recommend prosecutorial referrals to the state attorney general's office. He had never used any of those powers for anything involving his own family. He had been careful about that, in the way that people with genuine integrity were careful not performatively, not for credit, but simply because the line mattered to him and he knew where it was. Today he was not here because his daughter had been suspended. He was here because a board of education had been operating a financial fraud scheme against a public school district for 3 years, and a 16-year-old student had found the evidence that his own team had been circling without landing on. And then those same board members had used school disciplinary authority to retaliate against her. That was not a personal matter. That was a pattern of institutional misconduct, with a minor caught in the middle of it. He walked into conference room B, set the accordion folder on the table, and sat down. Benjamin Walsh had the lean, precise look of someone who had spent 30 years in institutional law and had long since given up performing urgency he didn't feel. He looked at the folder. He looked at Theodore. "How long have you had this? The full picture, since last night?" "I've been building toward it for about 2 months. The student's research? Completed independently. She's my daughter." Walsh let that sit for a moment. He picked up the top document from the stack Theodore had slid across the table. He read the first page carefully, turned to the second, scanned the third. He set it down. "This is enough to open a formal investigation today," Theodore said. "This isn't an opening. It's a conclusion. The investigation is done." Walsh looked at the 2 auditors seated to his left. One of them was already marking pages. "What do you want the sequence to be?" Theodore looked at the window. The October light came in flat and clear. "By the book," he said, but quickly. The parent notification that Margaret had sent out did precisely the opposite of what she intended. The parents who received it did not conclude that the unnamed student had been spreading misinformation. They concluded, many of them within the first 20 minutes, that a student had reported something the board didn't want reported, and that this was the response. The message thread in the parent group became unwieldy within an hour. By early afternoon, it was no longer a thread about the unnamed student. It was a thread about the school's finances. Diana Ashworth had been covering the education beat at the local paper for 7 years. She received a tip from a parent contact at 2 in the afternoon and began making calls. One of her calls went to the communications office at the State Department of Education. The communications officer, following protocol, confirmed that Commissioner Morrison had been in a meeting at the department that morning. He did not confirm the subject of the meeting. He did not need to. Diana called Edward Callum's administrative line for comment. She mentioned, in the way that reporters did when they wanted a specific reaction, that the meeting had involved financial records from the Hargrove district. She listened to the quality of the silence that followed her statement. At 3:15, Edward called Margaret. At 3:18, Margaret called Charles. Charles had already retained a private attorney and did not pick up. It was at 3:40 that Margaret made the mistake that could not be undone. She was composing a message to Edward and Holt on her laptop, a message discussing what they called the Scarlet situation, and referencing the need to protect the Meridian arrangement from further scrutiny. She was tired. She was distracted. She selected the wrong distribution list from her address book. The message went to every parent in the school's contact directory. All 412 of them. She realized what had happened 40 seconds later. She sent a follow-up message asking everyone to disregard the previous message. By then, the first message had already been forwarded outside the district. Edward's personal attorney called him at 4:02. Not the district's attorney, his own. The special session of the Hargrove District Board of Education was convened at 6 that evening in the board's meeting room, a rectangular space with long fluorescent lights, an elevated platform for the board table, and rows of plastic chairs for the public. The session had been called by the State Department of Education under the authority of the Institutional Integrity Review process. Attendance by all board members was compulsory. Every chair in the public section was occupied. Parents stood along the side walls. Diana Ashworth sat in the far corner with a notebook on her knee. Grace and her mother were in the third row. Scarlet was not there. Theodore had asked her to stay home. She had agreed without argument, which told him she trusted him, and that trust sat in his chest like something heavy and warm. Theodore walked in at 6:04, set his bag on the table, and sat down facing the board. He wore a dark suit. He did not look around the room. He had no need to assess the crowd, because he had not come here to manage public opinion. He had come to do a specific thing in a specific way. Benjamin Walsh opened the session with a formal statement. He read from a document that named the 3 Meridian EdTech Solutions contracts by date and dollar amount, a combined total of $340,000 dispersed over 3 fiscal years. He named the 3 individuals listed as directors of Meridian EdTech Solutions at the time of each contract signing. He named their current positions on the board. Edward Callum interrupted to say that the contracts had been approved through proper process and that all procedures had been followed. His voice was measured, but it had lost the softness that authority gave it when authority felt secure. Theodore spoke for the first time. He did not raise his voice. He asked one question: who signed the approval documents for each of those 3 contracts? The answer, borne out by the documents now sitting open on the table in front of Walsh, was that all 3 contracts had been approved by a vote, in which Callum, Alcott, and Brennan had all participated. All 3 had voted in favor, and in none of those votes had any of them disclosed that they held a financial interest in the contracting company. The disclosure requirement was not a suggestion. It was codified under Section 18 of the state's Education Governance Act, and it existed precisely to prevent what had happened here. One of the parents in the back row stood and asked the question that the whole room had been holding. And the student who found this, she was suspended for finding it? Theodore looked toward the back of the room. He nodded once. The room went very quiet. Holt began to speak about the school's right to manage student discipline internally. Theodore placed a document on the table and pushed it across to Walsh. The suspension was issued without a written disciplinary basis, without the required parental notification window, and without allowing the student to contact a guardian before being removed from the premises. Those 3 failures constitute a violation of Student Rights Policy 4.7. He paused. I have the original policy text here. Walsh added the document to the stack. At 7:14, Walsh read the final item into the record. It was a notice of administrative suspension pending formal investigation, issued against all sitting board members. Their access to district systems, financial accounts, and official communication channels would be suspended effective midnight. Edward Callum stood. He looked across the table at Theodore for the first time with something that was not composure. Theodore looked back at him without expression. There was nothing personal in it, which was perhaps the most devastating part, because it meant that what was happening to Edward Callum was not the result of a father's anger, but of a system functioning correctly for once. The formal termination of board members' service came 72 hours later, following completion of the accelerated institutional review. The findings were unambiguous. Edward Callum, Margaret Alcott, and Charles Brennan had approved contracts worth a combined $340,000 to a company they collectively owned, across 3 fiscal years, without disclosure. The pattern was not accidental. The documentation was thorough. The recommendation from the review team to the State Board of Education was unanimous. Richard Holt was placed on administrative suspension, pending a separate process addressing his conduct in the student disciplinary matter, specifically the retroactive documentation, the failure to allow parental contact, and the seizure of student materials without proper procedure. The outcome of that process would take longer. But the outcome was not in doubt. Meridian EdTech Solutions was required to return the full sum to the district. The company was added to the state's excluded vendor registry, which meant it could not contract with any public institution in the state. A referral to the State Attorney General's office was submitted for review of potential criminal charges. Diana's article ran on the front page of the local paper 2 days after the board session. It was not the article Edward had envisioned when he first contacted her. The headline concerned a student's research and the board's response to it. The piece was thorough and sourced, and it treated Scarlet's 3 weeks of work with the seriousness it deserved. It noted that the student was the daughter of the State Oversight Commissioner, but made clear that the initial findings had been made entirely independently before any official review process began. Evelyn Marsh came to the house on the 3rd day. Scarlet answered the door. Her teacher stood on the porch with her hands clasped in front of her, looking at the girl she had failed to protect when protection was the only thing required of her. "I knew something was wrong," Evelyn said. "I've known for a while. I was afraid of what it would cost me." She paused. "That was a cowardly choice. And you paid for it." "I'm sorry." Scarlet stood in the doorway for a long moment. "Why didn't you just tell me to be careful?" she finally asked. "That's all I needed. Just be careful." Evelyn didn't have an answer for that. Scarlet nodded slowly, the way her father nodded when he had processed something and arrived at its end. "It's okay," she said. "I mean, it's not, yet, but it will be." She let Evelyn in. Grace came over that afternoon with 2 bottles of sparkling cider from the grocery store up the road. The 2 of them sat on the back porch steps in their jackets while the light went orange over the neighbors' rooftops. They didn't talk about the board, or the meeting, or the article, or any of it for a while. They talked about the oral presentation Grace had finally given, 3 days late, which had gone fine. They talked about a movie they both wanted to see. After a while, Grace said, "Were you scared?" "When you were standing outside the school?" Scarlet thought about it honestly. "Yeah," she said, "but not of them. I was scared I'd gotten something wrong in the numbers. That was the only part that scared me." Grace laughed. "You are so much like your dad." "I know," Scarlet said. And she smiled. 3 weeks passed. The district operated under an interim management team, appointed by the state, composed of 2 retired administrators and an independent financial officer. A process was established for electing new board members, a process that included, for the first time, a parent representative and a teacher representative on the nominating committee, and a requirement for annual third-party financial audits beginning the following fiscal year. The Manila folder, Scarlet's original research, had been formally entered into the state review record as documentary evidence. Benjamin Walsh told Theodore, during a brief check-in call, that it was the most useful single piece of documentation produced during the entire review. Theodore thanked him and did not mention that the document had been produced by a teenager over 3 weeks, using nothing but public records and stubbornness. On Scarlet's first morning back at school, the house ran exactly as it always did. Theodore was up early. The kettle was on. He wore the flannel shirt. Scarlet came downstairs at 6:50, dressed, backpack on. She looked around the kitchen. She poured her own orange juice. She stood at the counter and drank it. "I'm taking the bus today," she said. Theodore looked at her over his coffee mug. "I want to," she said. "I think I should just walk in like normal." He nodded. "Okay." She set her glass in the sink, picked up her bag, and headed for the door. Then she stopped and turned back. She looked at him for a moment, her father in his kitchen, in his worn shirt, with his going cold coffee, and she said, "Dad, you knew about the school for months, didn't you? Before I started looking into it." He set his mug down. "I suspected. I didn't have what I needed." She held his gaze. "And my folder gave you what you needed. Your folder finished it." She stood with that for a second. "So I actually did what you were trying to do." He looked at her with something in his face she didn't often see there. Not pride exactly, it was quieter than pride and went further down. "You did it better," he said. She pushed open the back door and let the October morning in. He heard her footsteps on the porch stairs, then on the path, then nothing. The kitchen was quiet. Theodore picked up his coffee. On the desk in the back room, the accordion folder was gone, logged into evidence where it belonged. In its place was a folded piece of notebook paper. He had found it that morning when he sat down. Scarlet's handwriting, in the quick slanted script she used when she wasn't being careful. "Dad, I figured out the bus route. I'm good. Don't wait up at the drop-off." He read it once. He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. He stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and watched the light come over the rooftops, steady and clear, the way it always did on mornings that had nothing wrong with them at all.